It was a dark, cold night when Mark found himself walking through the dense woods. His feet crunched against the brittle leaves that carpeted the forest floor, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying foliage. The moon, half hidden behind thick clouds, cast a faint glow over the landscape, barely enough to guide his steps. He had always enjoyed the solitude of nature, but tonight, something was different. There was a strange stillness in the air, an unsettling quiet that made his skin crawl. Mark wasn't supposed to be here. He knew that. The woods were infamous for being cursed. Stories whispered around town told of strange disappearances, of people hearing voices in the trees, of shadows that moved on their own. But it had always been just that, stories. And Mark didn't believe in stories. He didn't believe in superstitions or curses. So when his friend Tom had dared him to venture into the woods at midnight, Mark had laughed it off. He had accepted the challenge without a second thought. After all, he was a rational man, a skeptic. But now, walking deeper into the forest with each step, a knot of unease began to form in his stomach. The further he walked, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Mark paused, looking around, but all he could see were the gnarled trees, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A sudden rustle in the bushes made him jump. He whipped around, heart racing, but the forest was empty. Just the wind. He exhaled slowly, trying to calm himself. He had to admit, though, there was something about the place that felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the tension. He pulled it out, relieved to have a distraction. It was a text from Tom. "You okay? You've been gone for 20 minutes. Mark stared at the screen, considering how to respond. Should he tell Tom about the weird feeling he had, the feeling that he wasn't alone? No. He didn't want to seem foolish. He typed back quickly, "Just taking a walk. I'm fine." But as soon as he hit send, a low, guttural sound echoed through the trees. Mark froze, his breath catching in his throat. It sounded like a growl, deep and primal, and it came from somewhere ahead of him. His heart pounded in his chest, the noise sending a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. He quickly typed a response to Tom, "Never mind, I'm heading back now." But something stopped him. Something made him hesitate. There was a faint flicker of movement in the distance, something large, dark, and hunched. It was barely visible in the shadows, but it was there. His pulse quickened. Was it an animal? No, this figure was too tall, too unnatural in its shape. Mark took a step forward, his curiosity outweighing his fear. He didn't know what he was expecting to find, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this strange encounter, was something he wouldn't be able to forget. He pushed through the underbrush, his breath quickening with each step. The figure moved again, closer this time. It was more than just a shape now, he could make out the contours of it, its hunched back, long limbs, and the glint of eyes reflecting the dim light. A chill ran down Mark's spine. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a wild animal or some trick of the moonlight. This was something else entirely. He backed away slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But it was no use. The creature, whatever it was, had already spotted him. With a swift, fluid movement, it turned its head toward him. The eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and Mark's blood ran cold. They weren't human eyes. They were too wide, too reflective, like glass marbles that shimmered in the dark. Panic surged through Mark's chest. He spun around, ready to flee, but his legs felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding him back. The sounds of the night, once comforting, had turned into a cacophony of whispers and growls. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed through the trees, not daring to look back. Then, the ground beneath his feet shifted. Mark stumbled, his ankle twisting painfully as he fell to the earth. He tried to catch himself, but his hands met only mud. The dark figure was closer now, its silhouette looming just beyond the trees. He could hear its footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer, each step causing the earth to tremble slightly. "Please," Mark whispered to himself, scrambling to get back on his feet. "What is this?" But before he could rise, something grabbed his shoulder. He whipped around, heart hammering, to find nothing. The hand that had touched him was gone, but the sensation lingered, a cold, unyielding pressure that seemed to tighten around his chest. The growl from earlier sounded again, closer now, and Mark's instincts screamed at him to run. He pushed through the pain in his ankle, his body moving purely on adrenaline as he sprinted blindly through the woods. The trees blurred around him, their branches slapping at his face as he ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart felt as though it would burst from his chest. Just when he thought he couldn't run any longer, he saw a faint light through the trees. It was distant, but it was there, probably the path leading back to the town. He surged forward, desperation giving him strength. But then, something strange happened. The light shifted. It wasn't a street lamp or the light from someone's house. No, this light moved, weaving through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the ground. It was as if the light itself was alive, shifting and changing with each movement. Mark stopped dead in his tracks. He had no idea what was happening. His heart pounded in his ears as the strange, glowing light grew brighter, drawing closer. Then, the light vanished. The forest was plunged back into darkness. And for the first time that night, Mark understood what it meant to be truly alone. Mark stood frozen in the pitch-black forest, his breath shallow, his body trembling. The eerie silence that followed the disappearance of the light was suffocating. The growl he had heard earlier now seemed distant, almost like a fading memory. But something else lingered in the air, a feeling that wasn't quite fear, but something deeper. Something primal. Mark's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What was that light? Was it real? And the creature, the one with the glassy eyes, was that real too? Mark tried to convince himself that he was simply imagining things, that the shadows and the growl were products of his anxiety. He had to get out of there. He had to find his way back to town before whatever this was found him. He turned around, squinting in the darkness. The path was nowhere to be seen. The trees loomed like towering giants, their gnarled branches stretching toward the sky. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced to figure out his next move. He had to find his bearings. But the forest felt different now, as if it had changed in some subtle, unexplainable way. It wasn't just the darkness or the strange noises. It was the feeling that the forest itself was alive, watching him, shifting around him. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their trunks leaning in as if they were whispering secrets to one another, secrets that Mark was not meant to know. He took a tentative step forward, but then froze. There, in the distance, just beyond the reach of his vision, he thought he saw a figure, just a glimpse, a fleeting shadow. It was gone in an instant, but his pulse spiked. Was it the creature? Was it something else? Or was his mind playing tricks on him? "Focus," he whispered to himself. "Get out. You need to get out." Mark started moving again, this time more cautiously. He strained his ears, listening for any sounds, anything that might guide him. But all he could hear was the relentless beating of his own heart and the soft rustling of the leaves underfoot. The silence was unnerving. He continued walking, his mind swirling with panic and confusion. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. It was as though eyes were fixed on him from every direction. His skin prickled, every hair on his body standing on end. He had to keep moving, keep pushing forward. But each step felt like it brought him deeper into the unknown, further away from safety. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, Mark couldn't tell anymore. Time felt distorted in the woods, as if the rules of the world no longer applied. Every shadow seemed to shift and twitch, every crack in the underbrush seemed to conceal something waiting, watching. He was beginning to wonder if he had made a mistake, if he had gone too far. Then, a voice broke the silence. It wasn't a voice that he could understand, not in any human sense. It was a low, guttural murmur, a sound that crawled under his skin and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Mark froze, the voice washing over him, filling his ears with a sense of foreboding. It came from somewhere behind him, though he couldn't pinpoint where. His breath caught in his throat. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The voice responded, but it wasn't in words. It was more like a whispering wind, like an old language that didn't belong in this world. Mark's skin went cold, the chill seeping into his bones. Before he could react, the growl returned, louder, closer. His heart skipped a beat as he spun around, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the dark, the oppressive weight of the silence. "Get a grip, Mark," he muttered to himself, but his voice sounded hollow, even to his own ears. His rational mind told him to turn back, to find his way out of the woods, but something deep within, urged him to keep moving forward. To discover what this thing was, what it wanted. He took a step, then another, each movement feeling heavier than the last. The growl echoed again, this time followed by the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. It was getting closer. Panic gripped him like a vice, and he turned, running blindly through the forest. The sound of pursuit was unmistakable now. Whatever it was gaining on him. He could hear the creature's heavy, labored breathing, the sound of its claws scraping against the bark of trees as it closed in on him. Mark pushed himself harder, forcing his legs to move faster, even though they felt like lead. His breath came in gasps, and his vision blurred. Every step felt like it might be his last. He could hear the branches cracking under the weight of something large moving through the woods behind him. The light, was it still there? He couldn't tell. All he could focus on was the terrifying sound of the creature drawing nearer. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that made his blood run cold. He could feel its presence, even though he couldn't see it. His foot caught on a root, and he tumbled forward, crashing into the ground with a sickening thud. His head spun as he struggled to push himself up, but his legs refused to cooperate. Everything was spinning now, a blur of darkness and shadows. He could hear the thing moving closer, its footsteps heavy, deliberate. Mark pushed himself up with a frantic effort, his eyes wide with terror. He had to get up. He had to run. He couldn't let it catch him. And then, the forest went silent. The growling stopped. The crashing stopped. The whispers stopped. For a moment, Mark thought he had escaped, that whatever had been chasing him had given up. He stood motionless, listening to the stillness around him. But it was the wrong kind of stillness. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the night. It was suffocating, unnatural. Then, the voice spoke again. This time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind him, and it sent a wave of cold fear crawling up his spine. "Why did you come here?" Mark's blood ran cold. He couldn't turn around. He couldn't bring himself to face whatever it was that was speaking to him. He stood there, paralyzed, waiting for something to happen, waiting for some sign of what he was supposed to do next. But the silence stretched on. Mark stood there, rooted to the spot, his body trembling as the voice echoed through the darkness. It wasn't a question he could answer. How could he explain? He had come to this place out of curiosity, out of a desire to prove something, to challenge the stories, to dismiss the whispers of the townsfolk. But now, standing in the cold grip of the forest, he understood that there were things in this world far beyond his comprehension. "Why did you come here?" The voice repeated, this time more insistent, almost angry. Mark's throat tightened, but his legs refused to obey. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body remained frozen, as though the very air around him was holding him in place. The ground beneath his feet seemed to vibrate with a low hum, like the pulse of something ancient and powerful. He had been foolish to come here. He had been foolish to ignore the warnings, to dismiss the rumors as nothing more than local superstition. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg for mercy, anything, but no words came out. It was as though the air had thickened, swallowing his voice, stifling his breath. Then, a sudden movement, fast, blindingly quick, caught his attention. Something flashed across his peripheral vision, a blur of dark movement, too fast to track. His eyes darted toward it, but before he could react, the world around him seemed to shift. The trees around him twisted, their branches contorting in unnatural angles. The ground buckled and cracked, as if the earth itself was groaning under the pressure. And from the shadows, the figure appeared again, the creature he had glimpsed earlier, its form more solid now, more defined. It stepped into the dim light, revealing its full shape, tall, hunched, with long, bony limbs and a face that seemed to have been stitched together from parts of different creatures. Its eyes, those wide, glassy orbs, glowed in the darkness, fixed directly on him. Mark's breath hitched in his throat as the creature's mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, sharp teeth glinting in the faint moonlight. It moved toward him, slow but deliberate, its steps making no sound, as though it was walking on air. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, the voice now no longer a whisper, but a jagged rasp that tore through the stillness. "This is our home. You are not welcome here." Mark's mind raced, his body desperate to flee, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. He couldn't move. He couldn't even blink. The creature loomed over him, towering above him with its unnatural height, its breath foul and cold against his skin. "You've awakened something," it said, its voice thick with malice. "And now, you will pay the price." With a sudden, violent motion, the creature reached out, grabbing Mark by the throat. Its grip was cold, unyielding, like iron wrapped in ice. Mark gasped for air, his vision beginning to blur at the edges as the pressure on his neck increased. His hands clawed at the creature's wrist, but it was no use. The darkness seemed to close in around him, suffocating him, crushing him under its weight. Just as he thought he was about to lose consciousness, the pressure suddenly released. Mark collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his body shaking uncontrollably. He rolled onto his back, his heart hammering in his chest as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The creature was still standing over him, watching him, its eyes glowing with a mixture of hunger and contempt. "You think you can escape," it sneered, its voice dripping with amusement. "You think you can leave this place unchanged?" Mark's mind reeled as the creature's words sank in. Leave? He hadn't been thinking of leaving. He had been thinking of survival. But now, as the reality of the situation set in, he realized that there was no escape. Not from this creature. Not from the woods. The forest had claimed him. It had chosen him. The creature knelt down beside him, its breath rancid, smelling of decay and rot. Mark recoiled instinctively, but the creature's grip tightened once more, holding him in place. Its face was now mere inches from his, its cold, dead eyes staring into his soul. "You should have listened," it muttered, almost as though it were speaking to itself. "You should have stayed away." Then, to Mark's horror, it smiled again, and this time, the smile was wide, impossibly wide, stretching across its face until its mouth was an open abyss. From within that mouth, a voice emerged, a voice that Mark recognized, a voice that sent a spike of terror into his heart. "Mark! Mark! Mark, help me!" It was the voice of his sister, Emily, calling out to him from the darkness. His heart stopped for a moment, the blood draining from his face. No. No, this couldn't be real. Emily had been missing for days. He had reported her disappearance to the police, searched for her in every corner of town, and now she was here, in the woods, in the mouth of this creature. The creature chuckled softly, the sound of Emily's voice still echoing in its maw. "You're too late," it said. She belongs to us now. Just as you will. Mark's pulse raced as he struggled against the creature's grip, his mind whirling in panic. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. The forest seemed to close in tighter around him, the shadows growing darker, the voices more insistent. He could hear Emily's voice calling for help again, but this time, it was no longer the sound of his sister, it was the sound of 1,000 other voices, all crying out in agony, all twisted and broken. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. The forest had claimed him, just as it had claimed Emily. The creature was right. He had awakened something that would never let him go. With a final, resounding laugh, the creature let go of Mark, shoving him to the ground. Mark lay there, gasping for breath, as the creature began to fade into the shadows, its glowing eyes the last thing he saw before darkness enveloped him completely. Mark's eyes snapped open, but the world around him was a blur, a swirling vortex of darkness and shadows. His mind reeled, the horrific images of the creature and the lost voices filling his thoughts. Where was he? Had it all been a dream? The question echoed in his head, but it felt more like a cruel trick, one he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. He tried to move, but his body was heavy, as if buried under the weight of the very earth itself. His arms and legs felt numb, unresponsive. His breath came in shallow gasps, and for a moment, he thought he might suffocate in the oppressive silence of the forest. He couldn't see the sky. The trees had closed in so tightly around him that the world felt like it had shrunk to a confined, suffocating prison. With a strained effort, Mark pushed himself up. His hands scraped against rough, uneven ground, and he pulled himself to his feet, his vision still swimming. His pulse pounded in his ears. He needed to escape. He needed to find Emily. His mind was scattered, disjointed. Hadn't he been unconscious? Wasn't he lying on the forest floor, paralyzed by the creature's grip? The last thing he remembered was the horrible face, the twisted grin of the thing, and then Emily's voice. It was the voice of his sister, but distorted, corrupted by the creature's presence. He had to find her. He had to make sense of it all. Mark stumbled forward, his feet dragging against the uneven terrain. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches stretching and twisting as if they were reaching for him. He could feel the weight of their gaze. He could hear the faint rustling of leaves, the whispers that made his skin crawl. Was it just the wind? Or was it something more? The air was thick with the smell of decay and wet earth. He felt like he was sinking into the ground with every step he took. His legs wobbled beneath him, as though they could give out at any moment. He didn't have time to stop. His sister was somewhere out there, lost in the woods, lost to whatever terrible force had taken hold of this place. Mark's thoughts were scattered, torn between the urgency of escape and the need to understand what was happening. Was this some kind of hallucination? Was it a fever dream brought on by his panic? But no, he couldn't deny it. The creature had been real. The growl. The eyes. The voice. Suddenly, he froze. There it was again. The voice. Soft, but unmistakable. Mark. He whipped his head around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. No movement. Just the trees swaying in the wind. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. His heart pounded in his chest. Was it Emily? Could she be calling to him? Or was it something else? Something that wore her voice like a mask. Mark. The voice was louder now, closer. But still, it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The air itself seemed to vibrate with it. The whisper felt like fingers scratching at his mind, trying to pry it open, to invade his thoughts. He shook his head, trying to block it out, but it only grew stronger. Come closer, Mark. The voice was laced with something dark, something that felt foreign to the warmth of his sister's kindness. This was not Emily. This was something else. But it was so convincing. So real. Mark's feet were moving before he even realized it. The voice had a pull, an undeniable draw that tugged at him, and before he knew it, he was stumbling deeper into the woods, his senses clouded by the darkness and the strange whispers that seemed to call out to him from the trees themselves. And then, just as suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating. The kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, that made you feel like you were not alone in the room, but trapped in some sort of void. The forest was still, and all that remained was the thudding of Mark's own heart in his chest. He paused, his breath ragged, his chest heaving. Was this it? Was he meant to find Emily? Or was this just another trap, another part of the nightmare the forest had prepared for him? That's when he saw it. In the distance, just ahead of him, a flicker of light. It wasn't a street lamp, nor the glow of a phone screen. It was a soft, flickering light, like the glow of a lantern, bobbing through the trees. He squinted, unsure if it was real. Was it the light he had seen earlier? The one that had vanished so quickly? No. This light was different. It felt more purposeful. More deliberate. He moved toward it, his body heavy with exhaustion but driven by the thought of finding something, anything that could give him an answer. With each step, the light grew brighter, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. He quickened his pace, not caring if he was being led deeper into the heart of the woods. He had to know. But as he drew closer, he realized something was wrong. The light flickered unnaturally, moving as if caught in the wind, though there was no breeze. It bobbed and weaved between the trees, darting out of view and then reappearing in an entirely different spot. It didn't make sense. Mark stopped again, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes on him, even though he couldn't see them. It was as though the very trees were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he stood there, the light bouncing in and out of view. His heart raced again, faster this time. Should he go toward it? Was it a sign? Or was it another part of the forest's twisted game? The light flickered one final time before disappearing altogether. Mark cursed under his breath, his frustration mounting. He had been so close. So close to finding something, anything that would tell him where Emily was, where the creature had taken her. But now, it was gone. He was alone again. And that's when he heard it. A scream. A high-pitched, desperate wail that tore through the stillness of the forest. It was unmistakable, Mark knew that scream. He knew it anywhere. It was Emily. Without thinking, he bolted toward the sound. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that it drowned out everything else, the world becoming a blur of trees and darkness as he ran. He couldn't think. He couldn't stop. He had to reach her before it was too late. The trees parted, and before him lay a small clearing. At the center of the clearing, a figure was kneeling, its back to him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was Emily. But it wasn't her. Her back was hunched, her hands twisted unnaturally, her hair hanging in front of her face like a dark curtain. Her body seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, as if something darker, something monstrous, was beneath the surface. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes gleaming with that same dark, glassy glow he had seen before, the same unnatural shine as the creature's. "Mark," she whispered, her voice echoing in the night. It wasn't Emily. Not anymore.